Welcome back to the Silent Collection. Tonight, we travel to the southern tip of Africa, a land where two great oceans meet, where vast grasslands stretch toward distant mountains, ancient deserts glow beneath golden sunsets, and wildlife has roamed for thousands of years. Long before modern cities rose across the landscape, before highways crossed the countryside or mines reached deep beneath the earth, South Africa was home to many different peoples, cultures, and traditions. To understand apartheid, we must begin long before the word itself existed. Our story starts hundreds of years earlier. So settle into a comfortable position. Allow your breathing to slow. As the sounds of the modern world gently fade away, let us travel back through the centuries. Chapter 1. Before apartheid, a land of many peoples. For tens of thousands of years, Southern Africa was home to some of humanity's earliest ancestors. Archaeological discoveries suggest that modern humans have lived in this region for well over 100,000 years. Stone tools, ancient cave paintings, and fossil remains tell the story of generations who hunted, gathered, explored, and adapted to an ever-changing landscape. Among the earliest known communities were the San people, sometimes called Bushmen by European settlers, though many today prefer the name San. They lived as skilled hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons and developing an extraordinary understanding of the natural world. Every plant, every animal track, every changing wind carried meaning. Their knowledge allowed them to survive in environments that appeared harsh to outsiders. Alongside them lived the Khoikhoi pastoral communities who raised cattle and sheep across the western regions of southern Africa. Livestock represented wealth, security, and social standing. Communities traded, celebrated, and built relationships that connected families across great distances. For many centuries, these societies developed independently, adapting to local climates and landscapes. Their histories were passed from one generation to the next through stories, songs, and traditions rather than written records. Around 2,000 years ago, another gradual migration began to reshape the region. Bantu-speaking farming communities slowly moved southward from Central Africa over many generations. They brought new agricultural techniques, ironworking skills, and established permanent villages. Rather than replacing the people already living there, these migrations often led to trade, cooperation, cultural exchange, and at times, competition for land and resources. Over hundreds of years, diverse kingdoms and chiefdoms emerged across southern Africa. Communities developed distinct languages, customs, and systems of leadership. Among them were the ancestors of today's Zulu, Xhosa, Sotho, Tswana, Venda, Tsonga, Ndebele, and many others. The South Africa we know today has always been a place of remarkable diversity. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, many cultures had already shaped its history. For much of the ancient world, southern Africa remained unknown to Europe. Its coastline was long, rugged, and difficult to navigate. Portuguese sailors became the first Europeans to round the southern tip of Africa during the Age of Exploration. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias successfully sailed around what became known as the Cape of Good Hope. A decade later, Vasco da Gama followed the same route on his voyage to India. Despite these achievements, Portugal chose not to establish a permanent colony at the Cape. Instead, its ships simply stopped briefly for fresh water and supplies before continuing eastward. For more than a century and a half, the Cape remained largely outside European settlement. The indigenous communities continued their lives as they had for generations. That would begin to change in the middle of the 17th century. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company established a small refreshment station at Table Bay under the leadership of Jan van Riebeeck. The original purpose was practical rather than ambitious. Ships sailing between Europe and Asia needed fresh water, vegetables, and meat after spending months at sea. Few imagined that this modest settlement would eventually grow into one of southern Africa's most important cities. At first, the settlement remained small. Gardens were planted. Simple buildings were constructed. Trade developed between Dutch settlers and local Khoiak communities. Some exchanges were peaceful and mutually beneficial. Others led to disagreements over livestock, grazing land, and access to resources. As more settlers arrived, the demand for land steadily increased. Farms expanded beyond the original settlement. The balance between newcomers and indigenous communities slowly began to shift. The Dutch East India Company also brought enslaved people to the Cape. Unlike slavery in some other colonies, many of these enslaved individuals did not come from nearby African communities. Instead, they were transporting from places such as present-day Indonesia, India, Madagascar, Sri Lanka, and parts of East Africa. These diverse cultures gradually blended with local populations, contributing to the rich cultural heritage of the Cape. Languages mixed. Foods evolved. Religious traditions took root. Communities formed despite immense hardship. Many of the customs that define the Cape today trace their origins to these early encounters between peoples from across the Indian Ocean. As the 18th century progressed, European settlers continued moving farther inland. Some became known as trekboers, semi-nomadic farmers who sought new grazing land for their livestock. Living far from Cape Town, they developed an independent way of life shaped by isolation, farming, and frontier conditions. Along these expanding frontiers, encounters between settlers and African communities became increasingly complex. There were periods of trade and cooperation, but also conflicts over land, livestock, and political authority. The landscape itself became part of a much larger story, one that would influence southern Africa for generations to come. By the end of the 18th century, another European power entered the picture. Britain occupied the Cape during the Napoleonic Wars and formally took control in the early 19th century. British administration introduced new legal systems, encouraged immigration from Britain, and expanded colonial governance. These changes brought opportunities for some, while creating uncertainty for others. Many Dutch-descended settlers, who would later become known as Afrikaners, felt increasingly dissatisfied with British rule. Differences over language, administration, and policies, including the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1834, contributed to growing tensions. For many frontier farmers, the future seemed uncertain. Some chose a different path. They packed their wagons, gathered their families, and began journeys into the interior in search of greater independence. History remembers this migration as the Great Trek. The Great Trek would reshape southern Africa in profound ways. New Boer republics emerged. Relationships with existing African kingdoms became increasingly important. New alliances formed. New conflicts arose. And the foundations of modern South Africa slowly began to take shape. Yet no one living through those years could have imagined that, more than a century later, the country would adopt one of the most extensive systems of racial segregation the modern world had ever seen. The chapters still lay far in the future. For now, South Africa remained a land of many peoples, many languages, and many competing visions of what its future might become. As the 19th century unfolded, discoveries of diamonds and gold would transform the region forever, drawing wealth, migrants, imperial ambitions, and political struggles that would ultimately pave the road toward apartheid. Chapter 2. Diamonds, Gold, and the foundations of segregation. As we continue our journey through South Africa's history, let us leave behind the quiet farming settlements of the 18th century and step into a century of remarkable change. The 19th century would reshape the southern tip of Africa more dramatically than any period before it. Small frontier communities would become bustling towns. Remote valleys would fill with thousands of hopeful prospectors. Ancient landscapes would be transformed by railways, mines, and growing cities. Fortunes would be made almost overnight. Empires would compete for influence. And the political decisions made during these years would leave an enduring mark on generations to come. Tonight, we explore how diamonds and gold changed everything. By the early 1800s, Southern Africa remained a region of remarkable diversity. British colonies occupied parts of the coast. Independent African kingdoms flourished across the interior. The Boer republics of the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, often called the Transvaal, had been established following the Great Trek. Each region had its own leaders, customs, and ambitions. There was no single nation known as South Africa. Instead, the land was divided among different governments and societies, each navigating its own future. For many people living during this time, life still revolved around farming, cattle, local trade, and close-knit communities. Few could imagine that hidden beneath the earth lay resources that would transform the region forever. In 1867, near the banks of the Orange River, a young boy found an unusual stone while playing. The stone caught the attention of local residents. Eventually, experts examined it and confirmed what few had expected. It was a diamond. News spread quickly. Within months, prospectors from across southern Africa, and eventually from Europe, Australia, and North America, began arriving in search of fortune. The quiet countryside near present-day Kimberley soon became one of the world's busiest mining districts. Thousands of tents appeared almost overnight. Dusty paths became crowded streets. Businesses, hotels, workshops, and supply stores sprang into existence to serve the growing population. What had once been open land was transformed into a thriving mining town. Mining diamonds by hand was difficult work. Men dug narrow shafts into the earth, often working long hours beneath the hot African sun. As more diamonds were discovered, mining operations grew larger and increasingly organized. Independent miners gradually gave way to larger companies capable of purchasing equipment, hiring workers, and controlling production. Among the businessmen who emerged during this period was Cecil Rhodes. An English-born entrepreneur, Rhodes recognized that controlling diamond production could bring enormous wealth. Through a series of mergers and acquisitions, he helped establish one of the most influential mining companies in the world. His vision extended beyond mining. He believed that the British Empire should expand across much of southern Africa, a belief that shaped both business and politics during the late 19th century. Today, historians continue to study Rhodes as a deeply influential and controversial figure whose legacy remains the subject of debate. The diamond industry required a large workforce. Workers came from many different backgrounds. Some traveled from nearby communities. Others journeyed from distant regions in search of employment. As mining companies expanded, they introduced systems designed to control labor and protect valuable gemstones. Workers often lived in enclosed compounds, separated from surrounding communities. Movement was carefully monitored, and regulations governed many aspects of daily life. Although these systems were created primarily for economic reasons, historians often note that they introduced methods of labor control and segregation that influenced later government policies. In many ways, Practices first used within the mining industry became models for broader systems that would emerge decades later. Just as the diamond fields transformed the Cape, another extraordinary discovery changed the interior. In 1886, enormous deposits of gold were found on the Witwatersrand. The discovery sparked one of the greatest gold rushes in history. Thousands upon thousands of people arrived almost immediately. Within only a few years, the small settlement of Johannesburg grew into one of the fastest-growing cities in the world. Roads expanded. Railways connected distant regions. Banks opened their doors. Factories appeared. Businesses flourished. People speaking dozens of languages walked the same streets. Engineers, merchants, laborers, teachers, doctors, and adventurers all came hopping to build new lives. Johannesburg became a symbol of opportunity, ambition, and rapid industrial growth. Yet beneath the excitement lay growing inequalities. Gold mining demanded enormous investment. Deep-level mines required expensive machinery, skilled engineers, and large numbers of laborers. Mining companies sought ways to reduce costs while maximizing production. Different categories of work developed. Many skilled positions were reserved for white workers, while many black workers were employed in lower-paid roles under far more restrictive conditions. These employment practices reflected ideas that had already taken root in colonial society, but they also reinforced patterns of racial inequality that would continue into the 20th century. As industries expanded, governments increasingly introduced legislation regulating where people could live, work, and travel. While these laws varied from region to region, they shared a common goal of controlling labor and maintaining social order according to the thinking of the time. Economic success also attracted political attention. Britain viewed the mineral wealth of southern Africa as strategically important. The Boer republics wished to maintain their independence. Tensions between these interests steadily increased. Disagreements over political rights, taxation, and control of the gold fields created an atmosphere of growing uncertainty. Although diplomacy continued, many observers feared that conflict might become unavoidable. Their concerns proved well-founded. In 1899, war broke out between the British Empire and the two Boer republics. Known today as the Second Anglo-Boer War, it lasted nearly 3 years. The conflict involved large military campaigns, guerrilla warfare, and widespread disruption across the countryside. Many farming communities found themselves caught between opposing forces. Homes, crops, and livestock were destroyed as part of military strategies designed to deny resources to combatants. The war also saw civilians, including women and children, placed in concentration camps by the British authorities. Conditions in many camps were poor, and disease and malnutrition claimed thousands of lives. Black South Africans were also confined in separate camps, where many endured similarly harsh conditions and significant loss of life, though these experiences received less public attention at the time. The war left deep emotional scars that would influence relationships between communities for decades. By 1902, the fighting came to an end. The Boer republics accepted British rule under the Treaty of Vereeniging. Although peace had been restored, the challenge of governing the region remained. British officials and Afrikaner leaders gradually sought ways to rebuild the economy and establish a new political framework. This process eventually led to one of the most significant moments in South African history. On the 31st of May, 1910, the Union of South Africa was established. The Cape Colony, Natal, the Transvaal, and the Orange River Colony were united into a single self-governing dominion within the British Empire. For many white South Africans, the Union represented a fresh beginning after years of conflict. Yet the negotiations that created the new government largely excluded Black South Africans and many other communities from meaningful political participation. The voices of millions of people were absent from decisions that would shape the country's future. Over the following years, the new government introduced legislation that reflected existing racial inequalities while expanding them further. Perhaps the most significant early example came in 1913 with the Natives' Land Act. The law restricted where many Black South Africans could legally own or lease land, limiting ownership to designated areas that represented only a small portion of the country's total land. The act had lasting consequences for rural communities, agriculture, and patterns of land ownership. Many families were displaced or found their opportunities increasingly limited under the new legal framework. Many historians regard this legislation as one of the most important foundations upon which the later apartheid system would be built. Although apartheid itself would not begin until 1948, some of its underlying principles had already begun taking shape decades earlier. As the Union entered the 20th century, South Africa became a nation rich in natural resources and economic potential. Gold from the Witwatersrand helped finance industries around the world. Railways stretched across the countryside. Cities expanded year after year. Yet prosperity was not experienced equally. Political rights, economic opportunities, and legal protections differed greatly depending on race, reflecting policies that would become more deeply entrenched over time. These divisions would continue to widen during the decades ahead. As night settles over our journey, we leave South Africa in the years before the First World War. The country had become one nation on paper. But beneath the surface, profound inequalities were becoming embedded in law and society. In our next chapter, we will explore the years between 1910 and 1948, a period marked by industrial growth, political change, and the gradual creation of the legal framework that would ultimately become known around the world as apartheid. Chapter 3. From Union to Apartheid, the road to 1948. As our journey continues, we now enter a period that quietly reshaped South Africa. The years between 1910 and 1948 were not marked by one single event that changed everything overnight. Instead, change came slowly. One law after another. One policy after another. One election after another. Many people living through these decades could not have known that history would later view this period as the foundation upon which apartheid would eventually stand. Tonight, we explore those years. When the Union of South Africa was formed in 1910, many believed the country had entered a new era. Railways linked distant provinces. Gold mines continued producing enormous wealth. Agriculture expanded. New towns appeared. Industry attracted workers from across southern Africa. On the surface, South Africa appeared to be a country moving confidently into the 20th century. Yet beneath that progress, important questions remained unresolved. Who should vote? Who should own land? Who should have access to skilled jobs? And perhaps most importantly, who should hold political power? The answers given by successive governments increasingly reflected racial divisions that already existed in society. Although the Union combined 4 separate colonies into one nation, voting rights were not equal across the country. In the Cape Province, a limited number of black and colored citizens could vote if they met property and income requirements. This qualified franchise had existed before Union and continued for a time. Elsewhere, however, voting rights were largely restricted to white citizens. Rather than expanding political participation after Union, national governments gradually reduced it, for many non-white South Africans through later legislation. This reflected the priorities of the political leadership of the time, who believed that political authority should remain largely in white hands. Economic growth created opportunities, but those opportunities were not shared equally. Mining companies relied upon thousands of black workers to perform physically demanding labor underground. White workers often held supervisory or skilled technical positions. Governments increasingly passed laws protecting certain occupations for white employees. These became known as the color bar policies. Supporters argued that they protected skilled employment. Critics argued they institutionalized inequality by preventing many qualified black workers from advancing into better-paying positions. The debate would continue for decades. The First World War arrived in 1914. South African troops fought alongside the British Empire in several campaigns. At home, however, the war also exposed political divisions. Some Afrikaners still carried painful memories of the Anglo-Boer War. Not everyone supported fighting under the British flag. Even so, South Africa emerged from the conflict with a growing industrial economy. Factories expanded. Urban populations increased. Maori people moved into cities seeking employment. Johannesburg continued to grow into one of Africa's largest urban centers. As cities expanded, governments became increasingly concerned with housing, employment, and social order. Municipal authorities introduced regulations determining where different communities could live. Some neighborhoods became increasingly segregated. Although these policies varied between towns and cities, they reflected a broader trend towards separating residential areas by race. The process unfolded gradually. Entire communities did not disappear overnight. Instead, restrictions accumulated over many years. During the 1920s, labor disputes also became more common. One of the most significant occurred in 1922 during the Rand Revolt. Many white mine workers feared losing jobs to lower-paid labor. The strike escalated into armed conflict between protesters and government forces. The government eventually restored order using soldiers, artillery, and even aircraft. Although the revolt centered largely on employment rather than race alone, it demonstrated how economic anxiety and political decisions could become closely intertwined. It also reinforced government efforts to protect certain jobs for white workers. Another important development occurred in 1912. A group of educated black leaders established the South African Native National Congress. Their goal was to promote political rights through peaceful discussion, petitions, and constitutional methods. In 1923, the organization became known as the African National Congress, or ANC. Its founders hoped dialogue could persuade governments to reconsider discriminatory legislation. For many years, their approach remained patient and respectful. Delegations traveled to Britain. Petitions were submitted. Letters were written. Leaders sought meetings with government officials. Progress, however, was often slow. At the same time, other organizations emerged representing different communities throughout South Africa. Trade unions grew. Church leaders spoke about justice and equality. Journalists reported on changing conditions. Community organizations provided education and social support. South African society was becoming increasingly active politically. Different groups held very different visions for the country's future. Some advocated greater equality. Others believed existing racial separation should continue. Still others sought entirely different political arrangements. The global Great Depression of the 1930s also affected South Africa. Demand for exports declined. Unemployment increased. Economic uncertainty influenced politics across the country. Governments searched for ways to stabilize industries while protecting employment. During periods of hardship, political debates often became more intense. Questions about jobs, land, and public resources grew increasingly important. In 1936, Parliament passed the Representation of Natives Act. Among other changes, it removed the remaining common voters' roll rights held by many black voters in the Cape Province and replaced them with a separate system of representation. For many black South Africans, it represented another reduction in political participation. Although presented as administrative reform by its supporters, critics argued it further excluded black citizens from national decision-making. The direction of government policy had become increasingly clear. Political inclusion was narrowing rather than expanding. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 once again divided South African politics. Prime Minister J.B.M. Hertzog opposed entering the war on Britain's side. Parliament instead supported participation under Jan Smuts. South African soldiers served in North Africa, Italy, and elsewhere alongside Allied forces. At home, wartime industries expanded rapidly. Factories produced equipment and supplies. Cities grew even larger. People from rural communities moved into urban areas seeking work. The war accelerated industrialization more than almost any previous event. By the end of the Second World War in 1945, South Africa faced new challenges. Cities had expanded beyond expectations. Housing shortages became common. Industrial employment had increased dramatically. Large numbers of black South Africans had settled near urban centers where economic opportunities existed. Some politicians viewed these demographic changes with concern. They argued that stricter control over movement and residential patterns was necessary. Others believed South Africa should move toward greater inclusion and equal rights. The country's political future remained uncertain. One political party increasingly promoted a policy it described using the Afrikaans word apartheid. Literally translated, the word means apartness or separateness. Supporters claimed it would preserve different cultural communities by keeping them separate. They argued that each racial group should develop independently. Critics, however, warned that such a system would deny equal rights and deepen existing inequalities. At first, many people regarded the proposal as only one among several competing political ideas. Few realized how thoroughly it would transform everyday life. The general election of 1948 became one of the most significant elections in South African history. The National Party, led by Daniel Francois Malan, campaigned on a promise to implement apartheid as official government policy. Although the party received fewer total votes than its main opponent, South Africa's electoral system translated its support into a parliamentary majority. When the results were announced, a new government took office. Its leaders promised to build a society based upon legally enforced racial separation. Within months, preparations began for legislation that would reach into nearly every aspect of daily life. The laws that followed would determine where people lived, where they worked, whom they could marry, which schools they attended, which beaches they could visit, even how they would be officially classified by the state. South Africa was about to enter a new chapter in its history, one unlike anything it had experienced before. As our evening's journey draws to a close, we leave the country in 1948. The election is over. A new government has been formed. The word apartheid has entered official politics. For millions of South Africans, life is about to change in ways that few could yet imagine. In our next chapter, we will explore the first apartheid laws, the Population Registration Act, the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, and the Group Areas Act, and see how legislation began to reshape everyday life across the nation. Chapter 4. The First Apartheid Laws. Tonight, we arrive at one of the most significant turning points in South African history. When the National Party came to power in 1948, many people expected change. But few could have imagined just how many parts of everyday life would soon be affected. The new government did not build apartheid overnight. Instead, it introduced a series of laws, one after another. Each law addressed a different part of society. Taken individually, some appeared administrative. Others were presented as matters of public order. But together, they created one of the most comprehensive systems of legally enforced racial separation in the modern world. To understand apartheid, we must understand these laws. Prime Minister Daniel Francois Malan and his government described apartheid as a policy of separate development. Supporters argued that South Africa consisted of different racial and cultural groups, each of which should develop independently. They claimed that separation would preserve traditions, reduce conflict, and provide stability. Critics, however, argued that the policy was designed to maintain white political control while restricting the rights and freedoms of the country's black majority and other non-white communities. As the years passed, the effects of these laws became increasingly visible. Not only in Parliament, but in homes, schools, workplaces, railway stations, parks, and even on quiet neighborhood streets. One of the earliest laws passed by the new government was the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1949. The law prohibited marriages between white people and people of other racial groups. Until then, such marriages had been relatively uncommon, but they were legally possible. The government argued that racial separation should begin with the family itself. The following year, another law expanded these restrictions even further. The Immorality Amendment Act of 1950 made intimate relationships between white people and members of other racial groups illegal. These laws reached into the private lives of individuals in unprecedented ways. Relationships that had once been legal became criminal offenses. Families found themselves living under new legal uncertainties. For many people, these were the first signs that apartheid would extend far beyond politics. Yet perhaps no law shaped everyday life more profoundly than the Population Registration Act of 1950. At first glance, it appeared to be a system of official record-keeping. Every citizen would be classified according to a racial category. But this classification would become the foundation upon which nearly every other apartheid law depended. Government officials generally classified people into categories such as white, black, then officially referred to as native or Bantu in government documents of the period, colored, and later Indian. Each classification carried different legal rights, opportunities, and restrictions. In many cases, a person's classification determined where they could live, which school they could attend, what jobs they might qualify for, and even which public facilities they could use. Classifying millions of people was not always straightforward. South Africa was, and remains, a country of remarkable diversity. Many families had complex histories that did not fit neatly into government categories. Officials sometimes relied on ancestry, appearance, language, or community acceptance when making decisions. In disputed cases, classification boards reviewed evidence and made official determinations. These decisions could have life-changing consequences. Some families found themselves assigned different classifications despite being closely related. Brothers and sisters could, in rare instances, receive different legal classifications, creating painful divisions within the same household. For those affected, the process could feel deeply personal and profoundly unsettling. Once people had been officially classified, the government began determining where each group could legally live. This was achieved through another major piece of legislation, the Group Areas Act of 1950. The act gave the government authority to designate residential and business areas for specific racial groups. Over time, entire neighborhoods were rezoned. Communities that had lived together for generations sometimes discovered that their homes now lay within areas designated for another racial group. As these plans were implemented, many people were required to move. Some relocated voluntarily after receiving notices. Others were removed through government enforcement. The process unfolded over many years and affected communities across South Africa. One of the most well-known examples was District 6 in Cape Town. For generations, District 6 had been a vibrant neighborhood where people from many different backgrounds lived, worked, worshipped, and built their lives together. Its streets were filled with small businesses, schools, churches, mosques, music, and family gatherings. In 1966, the area was declared a white group area under the Group Areas Act. Over the following years, more than 60,000 residents were relocated to newly established townships outside the city center. Many homes were demolished. For countless former residents, the memories of District 6 remained vivid long after the buildings had disappeared. Today, the District 6 Museum stands as a place of remembrance, preserving the stories of those who once called the neighborhood home. Similar changes occurred elsewhere. In Johannesburg, Durban, Port Elizabeth, Pretoria, and many smaller towns, entire suburbs were redesigned according to racial classifications established by the government. For many white families, daily life changed relatively little. For many black, colored, and Indian South Africans, however, relocation often meant moving farther away from workplaces, schools, friends, and extended family. Longer journeys became part of daily life. Communities that had grown naturally over decades were divided by legislation. As cities changed, so too did public spaces. Signs began appearing across South Africa. Some designated facilities for whites only. Others identified areas intended for different racial groups. Separate entrances, separate waiting rooms, separate benches, separate beaches, separate railway coaches, separate public toilets. The government maintained that separate facilities could exist without necessarily being unequal. In practice, however, the quality of these facilities often differed considerably. Resources allocated to white communities were generally greater than those available elsewhere. This imbalance became increasingly apparent over time. Education also began to reflect the government's broader vision. Although the most significant educational reforms would come a few years later, with the Bantu Education Act of 1953, discussions about separate education systems were already underway. Government leaders argued that different communities should receive education suited to what they described as their respective roles in society. Many educators, religious leaders, and parents strongly disagreed. They believed education should provide equal opportunities regardless of race. This debate would soon become one of the defining issues of the apartheid era. For ordinary South Africans, the early 1950s were a time of adjustment and uncertainty. Some supported the government's policies, believing they would bring order and stability. Others opposed them from the beginning, seeing them as fundamentally unjust. Many families simply tried to continue with everyday life. Children still went to school. Parents still went to work. Shops still opened each morning. Trains still arrived at their stations. Yet beneath these familiar routines, society was changing. Quietly, steadily, law by law. Looking back today, historians often describe these early years as the period when apartheid became embedded within the legal system. The government had not yet introduced every policy that would define the decades ahead. But the framework was now in place. Classification, residential separation, restrictions on marriage, expanding segregation in public life. Each new law strengthened the next. Together, they formed a system that would shape the lives of millions. As our journey for tonight comes to an end, South Africa stands at the beginning of a new chapter in its history. The laws have been passed. Communities are beginning to change. Families are adapting to new realities. And across the country, voices of resistance are slowly growing louder. In our next chapter, we will meet those voices. We will explore the early campaigns against apartheid, the rise of the African National Congress as a mass movement, the Defiance Campaign, the Freedom Charter, and the growing determination of South Africans who believed a different future was possible. Chapter 5. Voices of Resistance. As we continue our journey through South Africa's history, we now arrive at a chapter defined not only by laws, but by the people who chose to challenge them. Throughout history, every society has contained a variety of opinions. Some people support change. Others resist it. Many simply try to carry on with their daily lives while the world around them shifts. South Africa during the 1950s was no different. As apartheid became more firmly established, opposition also began to grow. It emerged in churches, in schools, in trade unions, in community halls, in newspapers, and in conversations held quietly around family dinner tables. Some believed the new system would provide stability. Others believed it violated fundamental principles of equality and justice. Tonight, we explore those voices. The African National Congress, better known as the ANC, had existed since 1912. For many years, its leaders pursued gradual change through petitions, formal meetings, and appeals to government officials. They believed that careful negotiation and constitutional methods might persuade those in power to reconsider discriminatory laws. Progress, however, was slow. As the apartheid government introduced increasingly restrictive legislation after 1948, many younger members of the organization began questioning whether traditional methods were enough. Among them were individuals who would later become internationally known. One was a young lawyer from the Eastern Cape. His name was Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. Another was Walter Sisulu, whose organizational skills and leadership would help shape the movement. Alongside them worked Oliver Tambo, a respected educator and lawyer who believed deeply in peaceful political engagement. Together with many others, they represented a new generation determined to expand the struggle against apartheid. In 1944, several years before apartheid officially became government policy, these younger members had helped establish the ANC Youth League. The Youth League encouraged more active forms of political participation. Rather than relying only on petitions, they believed ordinary citizens should become directly involved through peaceful public action. Their ideas gained increasing support during the early 1950s as apartheid laws continued to expand. Across South Africa, more people began asking whether change could still be achieved through non-violent protest. One of the first major national campaigns came in 1952. It became known as the Defiance Campaign. Organized jointly by the ANC and the South African Indian Congress, the campaign encouraged volunteers to peacefully and deliberately break selected apartheid laws. Participants entered railway waiting rooms reserved for another racial group. They used entrances marked for others. Some ignored curfews or pass regulations. The goal was not confrontation for its own sake. Instead, organizers hoped that peaceful civil disobedience would highlight what they saw as the unfairness of the laws. Participants understood that many would likely be arrested. They accepted this possibility as part of the protest. The campaign attracted thousands of volunteers from many different communities. Black South Africans participated alongside Indian, colored, and white supporters who opposed apartheid. It was one of the first large-scale demonstrations showing cooperation across racial lines against the government's policies. Authorities responded by making arrests and introducing stricter security measures. Although the campaign did not immediately change the laws, it transformed the ANC into a far larger mass movement. Membership increased significantly. For many South Africans, political participation became part of everyday conversation for the first time. During these years, another remarkable leader emerged. His name was Chief Albert Luthuli. A respected teacher, community leader, and traditional chief, Luthuli became president of the ANC in 1952. He consistently advocated non-violent resistance. His speeches emphasized dignity, patience, and moral conviction rather than hatred or revenge. In 1960, his commitment to peaceful activism would earn him the Nobel Peace Prize, making him the first African recipient of the award. His leadership reminded many that courage could be expressed quietly as well as loudly. As resistance grew, government surveillance also increased. Meetings were monitored. Political organizations faced restrictions. Some leaders received banning orders. A banning order severely limited an individual's ability to participate in public life. Those affected might be prohibited from attending gatherings, speaking publicly, publishing articles, or even meeting with more than one person at a time outside their immediate family. For activists, these restrictions made organizing increasingly difficult. Yet many continued their work despite the obstacles. In 1955, representatives from numerous political, religious, labor, and community organizations gathered near Johannesburg for what became known as the Congress of the People. Delegates traveled from across the country, bringing ideas collected from ordinary citizens. Together, they drafted a document that became known as the Freedom Charter. It opened with a simple yet powerful declaration. South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. The Charter proposed a vision of a democratic South Africa in which all citizens would enjoy equal rights before the law. It called for universal voting rights, equal opportunities, fair labor practices, education, and the sharing of the country's wealth for the benefit of all. Supporters regarded it as a hopeful blueprint for the future. The government, however, viewed it with deep suspicion. The years that followed became increasingly tense. Police closely monitored political gatherings. Government officials argued that stronger security measures were necessary to maintain public order. Opposition organizations insisted that peaceful political participation should remain protected. The distance between these two positions continued to widen. In 1956, the government arrested 156 activists from a range of organizations, accusing them of high treason. Those charged included Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Chief Albert Luthuli, Helen Joseph, Ahmed Kathrada, Ruth First, and many other prominent figures. The legal proceedings became known as the treason trial. The trial lasted for several years before all of the accused were eventually acquitted in 1961. Although the government did not secure convictions, the lengthy legal process consumed enormous time and resources for those involved. Resistance was not limited to men. Women played an essential role throughout the struggle. One of the most significant moments came on the 9th of August, 1956. On that day, approximately 20,000 women gathered at the Union buildings in Pretoria. They came from different racial and cultural backgrounds. Their purpose was to protest the extension of past laws to women. For 30 minutes, they stood together in near silence. Then many began singing a phrase that would become one of South Africa's best-known protest songs. What hint Abafazi, what hint Imbokodo? In English, the phrase is often translated as, "You strike a woman, you strike a rock." The march became one of the defining moments of peaceful resistance during the apartheid era. Today, South Africa celebrates National Women's Day each year on the 9th of August in remembrance of that event. By the late 1950s, South Africa stood at a crossroads. The government remained committed to expanding apartheid. Opposition movements had grown larger and better organized than ever before. International observers were beginning to pay closer attention to events inside the country. Yet despite growing political activity, relatively few people could foresee just how dramatically the coming decade would unfold. A single day, in a small township south of Johannesburg, would alter the course of South African history forever. As our evening draws to a close, we leave South Africa in the final years of the 1950s. Hope still existed. Many believed peaceful protest could bring meaningful reform. Others feared confrontation was becoming increasingly likely. In our next chapter, we will travel to the township of Sharpeville, where a peaceful demonstration against past laws ended in tragedy, sending shockwaves through South Africa and around the world. The events of that day would become one of the most important turning points in the history of apartheid. Chapter 6. Sharpeville, the day everything changed. Tonight, we arrive at one of the most solemn chapters in South African history. Throughout our journey, we have watched apartheid take shape. We have seen new laws introduced, communities divided, families relocated, and ordinary citizens begin to organize peaceful campaigns for change. For much of the 1950s, many people still believed that patient negotiation and nonviolent protest might persuade the government to reconsider its policies. But in March of 1960, that hope would be profoundly tested. The events that unfolded in the township of Sharpeville would change South Africa forever. To understand what happened, we must first return to the past laws. Although various past systems had existed for many decades, the apartheid government expanded and enforced them with increasing determination. Many black South Africans were required to carry official documents, often referred to as pass books, that recorded personal information, employment details, and permission to be in certain areas. Police could request these documents during inspections. If someone did not have the required paperwork, or if the documents were considered invalid, they could face arrest, fines, or detention under the laws of the time. For many people, carrying a pass book became part of daily life. Leaving home without it could have serious consequences. The pass laws affected nearly every routine. A journey to work, a visit to family, shopping in town, traveling between districts. Simple everyday activities often required official permission. Many people came to view the pass system as one of the most visible symbols of apartheid. Opposition to these laws steadily increased. Political organizations held meetings, distributed pamphlets, and encouraged peaceful demonstrations. Among these organizations was the Pan-Africanist Congress, or PAC. The PAC had recently separated from the African National Congress after disagreements over strategy and political philosophy. Although the two organizations differed in some respects, both opposed apartheid and sought fundamental change. The PAC announced a nationwide campaign against the pass laws. Its leaders encouraged supporters to leave their passbooks at home and voluntarily present themselves at police stations. The intention was to peacefully overwhelm the legal system. If thousands of people were arrested at once, organizers hoped the government would be forced to reconsider the pass laws. One of the planned demonstrations took place in the township of Sharpeville, located south of Johannesburg. On the morning of 21 March 1960, residents began gathering. Some came alone. Others arrived with friends, neighbors, or family members. Many expected a peaceful demonstration. Accounts from the day indicate that some participants sang songs, talked among themselves, and waited outside the local police station. As the crowd grew, police presence also increased. Additional officers arrived. Armored vehicles were brought to the area. Military aircraft flew overhead at times, adding to the atmosphere of uncertainty. The situation became increasingly tense. Exactly what happened next has been studied, debated, and investigated for decades. Historical evidence shows that a confrontation developed between police and demonstrators. At approximately midday, police opened fire on the crowd. The shooting lasted only a short time, but its consequences were immense. 69 people lost their lives. More than 180 others were injured. Many of those who died had been struck while moving away from the scene, according to later investigations and testimony. The events shocked communities across South Africa and attracted widespread international attention. News of Sharpeville spread rapidly. Newspapers carried photographs from the township. Radio broadcasts reported the incident. Around the world, governments, journalists, and international organizations expressed concern over what had occurred. Within South Africa, grief and anger were felt in many communities. For families who had lost loved ones, the day would never be forgotten. For others, Sharpeville became a symbol of the deep divisions within the country. Today, 21 March is commemorated in South Africa as Human Rights Day, honoring those who lost their lives and reflecting on the importance of protecting the rights and dignity of all people. The government's response was swift. A national state of emergency was declared. Thousands of people were detained. Security measures were expanded. Shortly afterward, the government formally banned both the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress. The organizations could no longer operate legally inside South Africa. Public meetings became more difficult. Political activity increasingly moved underground. For many activists, Sharpeville marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Among those reflecting on the events was Nelson Mandela. For many years, he and other ANC leaders had advocated peaceful resistance. After Sharpeville and the banning of political organizations, some leaders concluded that peaceful protest alone was unlikely to bring change under the existing conditions. This was not a decision reached lightly. It followed years of petitions, demonstrations, arrests, and legal restrictions. Different individuals held different views about the best path forward. The debate within the movement was careful and often deeply personal. In 1961, a new organization was established. It became known as Umkhonto we Sizwe, meaning Spear of the Nation. Often abbreviated as MK, it operated separately from the ANC while sharing many of its political objectives. Its initial strategy focused on acts of sabotage against government infrastructure, such as power lines and administrative buildings, with the stated intention of avoiding loss of life. The aim, according to its founders, was to pressure the government while minimizing harm to civilians. The government regarded these actions as serious criminal offenses and intensified efforts to locate those responsible. The conflict within South Africa had entered a new phase. Nelson Mandela traveled secretly within South Africa and later abroad. He met with leaders in other African countries. He sought political support. He received military training during parts of his travels. Because of his movements, newspapers began referring to him as the Black Pimpernel, comparing his ability to avoid arrest to the fictional character who repeatedly escaped capture. But remaining hidden became increasingly difficult. Government security forces devoted considerable resources to tracking political activists. On the 5th of August 1962, Mandela was arrested near Howick in what is now KwaZulu-Natal. He was initially charged with leaving the country without permission and encouraging workers to strike. He was sentenced to prison. Yet this would not be the final legal case brought against him. Authorities continued investigating the broader activities of the underground movement. Less than a year later, another dramatic development unfolded. In July 1963, police raided a farm at Rivonia, near Johannesburg. The property, known as Lillisleaf Farm, had been used by members of the underground movement as a meeting place. During the raid, investigators discovered documents outlining plans, correspondence, and organizational material. The evidence gathered there became central to one of the most famous court cases in South African history, the Rivonia trial. Nelson Mandela, already imprisoned, joined several other accused leaders before the court. They faced charges that included sabotage and conspiracy. If convicted, they faced the possibility of the death penalty. The trial began in October 1963. It attracted worldwide attention. Journalists from many countries reported on the proceedings. Supporters gathered outside the courthouse. Governments monitored developments closely. During the trial, Mandela delivered what became one of the most well-known speeches of the 20th century. Near the end of his statement from the dock, he said, "It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The speech did not deny his political beliefs. Instead, it explained why he believed resistance had become necessary under the circumstances as he saw them. The statement has since become one of the defining documents of South African history. On 12 June 1964, the verdict was delivered. Mandela and several of his co-accused were found guilty. Rather than imposing the death penalty, the court sentenced them to life imprisonment. They were transporting to Robben Island, a prison located on an island several kilometers off the coast of Cape Town. For Mandela, imprisonment would last 27 years. For South Africa, it marked the beginning of a long period in which many of the country's best-known political leaders would spend years behind bars, while the struggle against apartheid continued both inside and outside the country. As the sun sets on this chapter of our story, South Africa stands transformed. Peaceful protest has given way to deeper conflict. Political organizations have been banned. Many leaders have been imprisoned. Others have gone into exile. Yet despite these developments, the debate over South Africa's future is far from over. If anything, it is only growing. In our next chapter, we will journey to Robben Island, explore daily life inside one of the world's most famous prisons, and discover how resistance continued, not only within South Africa, but across the world, as international pressure against apartheid steadily increased. Chapter 7. Robben Island, a prison that changed the world. Tonight, our journey takes us across the cold waters of Table Bay. From the shoreline of Cape Town, if the weather is clear, an island can be seen resting quietly on the horizon. It is small, flat, almost unremarkable from a distance. Tourists who visit today often describe the sea breeze, the cries of seabirds, and the breathtaking view of Table Mountain rising beyond the water. Yet for much of the 20th century, this island carried a very different meaning. Its name is Robben Island. For generations, it served as a place of isolation. A place where people were sent not simply to be imprisoned, but to be separated from society. Tonight, we explore life behind its walls. Long before the apartheid era, Robben Island had been used as a place of confinement. During Dutch colonial rule, political prisoners from across the Dutch Empire were sometimes sent there. In later years, people suffering from illnesses such as leprosy were also isolated on the island, reflecting the medical practices and understandings of those times. By the 20th century, Robben Island had become a maximum security prison. Its location made escape extremely difficult. The Atlantic Ocean surrounding the island is cold, with strong currents that have challenged even experienced swimmers. For prison authorities, the sea itself formed part of the prison's security. After the Rivonia trial in 1964, Nelson Mandela and several of his fellow prisoners arrived on the island. Among them were Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Ahmed Kathrada, Raymond Mhlaba, and others who had played important roles in the anti-apartheid movement. Many expected their imprisonment to silence them. Instead, something remarkable happened. The prison became, in the words of many former inmates, a place of continued learning, discussion, and resilience. Life inside Robben Island followed a strict routine. Prisoners rose early each morning. Cells were inspected. Meals were served according to prison schedules. Work assignments filled much of the day. Many prisoners were required to perform physically demanding labor, including work in a limestone quarry. The bright white stone reflected the sunlight intensely. Years later, Mandela explained that the constant glare had permanently affected his eyesight. The quarry itself still exists today. Visitors often pause there in silence, reflecting on the years spent by prisoners working beneath the open sky. The cells were small. Mandela's own cell measured only a few square meters. Inside were a sleeping mat, blankets, a bucket used as a toilet, and a small table. There were few personal possessions. Books were limited. Letters from family arrived infrequently and were carefully monitored by prison officials. Visits were rare and subject to strict rules. For prisoners, maintaining connections with loved ones required patience and endurance. A single letter might take weeks or months to arrive. Sometimes portions were removed by prison censors before delivery. Even the simplest family news could become precious. Conditions varied over the years. Former prisoners have described periods of harsh treatment, strict discipline, and limited privileges, particularly during the earlier decades. Over time, following legal challenges, public scrutiny, and changes within the prison system, some conditions gradually improved. Prisoners gained greater access to books. Educational opportunities expanded. Sports activities became possible under certain circumstances. Small improvements, though modest, had significant meaning for those living there. One of the most remarkable aspects of Robben Island was its culture of education. Many prisoners believed that knowledge represented a form of freedom that could not easily be taken away. Those with expertise in law taught legal principles. Former teachers offered lessons in mathematics, history, and literature. Economists explained financial systems. Writers discussed politics and philosophy. Languages were exchanged between prisoners from different backgrounds. Because formal classes were often restricted, learning sometimes took place quietly during work assignments, exercise periods, or conversations between cells. Former inmates later affectionately referred to this informal system as the University of Robben Island. There were no degrees, no graduation ceremonies, only people determined to keep learning despite difficult circumstances. Relationships also developed across political differences. Not every prisoner belonged to the same organization. Members of the ANC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, trade unions, and other political groups often found themselves sharing the same prison. Disagreements certainly existed. Debates could become passionate. Yet many prisoners later recalled that they learned from one another despite those differences. Ideas were challenged. Perspectives evolved. The years of imprisonment became, for many, a period of reflection as well as endurance. Outside the prison walls, South Africa continued changing. The economy expanded. Cities grew larger. Television arrived in 1976, although for many years political reporting remained carefully controlled by the government. Meanwhile, international awareness of apartheid steadily increased. Foreign journalists wrote articles. Documentaries were produced. Church leaders, academics, musicians, athletes, and students around the world began paying closer attention to events in South Africa. Mandela himself remained largely unseen. Photographs of him became increasingly rare because the government restricted publication of recent images. For many people overseas, his face remained frozen in photographs taken years earlier. He became known around the world not through television appearances, but through stories. During the 1970s, the United Nations adopted additional resolutions criticizing apartheid. Many countries debated economic sanctions. Some sporting organizations questioned whether South African teams should continue participating in international competition. Universities discussed academic boycotts. Artists debated whether to perform in South Africa. These discussions unfolded gradually over many years. There was no single moment when international opinion changed. Instead, awareness steadily grew. Within South Africa, everyday life continued. Millions of people went to work each morning. Children attended school. Farmers harvested crops. Businesses opened their doors. Life in many respects appeared ordinary. Yet beneath that ordinary routine, the country's political divisions remained unresolved. Many communities continued experiencing the effects of apartheid laws in housing, education, employment, and movement. Others supported the government's policies, believing they provided stability during a period of international tension and Cold War politics. South African society remained deeply divided over its future. For prisoners on Robben Island, the passing of time became almost its own rhythm. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. Some prisoners marked the passing seasons by watching seabirds nest along the shoreline. Others counted birthdays missed. Children grew into adults while fathers remained behind bars. Parents grew old. Friends passed away. Entire decades slipped quietly by. Yet despite the years, many prisoners later said they never abandoned hope that South Africa could one day become a country governed differently. Nelson Mandela gradually became a symbol recognized far beyond South Africa. Supporters called for his release. Governments raised his name during diplomatic discussions. Musicians dedicated songs to him. Students marched carrying his photograph. For some, he represented the broader struggle against apartheid. For others, he remained a convicted prisoner serving a lawful sentence imposed by the courts. These differing perspectives reflected the complex political realities of the era. What is beyond dispute is that Mandela's imprisonment became one of the most widely recognized political imprisonments of the 20th century. As our evening draws gently toward its close, the lights of Cape Town shimmer across Table Bay. From Robben Island, they must have seemed both close and impossibly far away. The prisoners could see the mainland. They could watch ships crossing the water. They could even make out Table Mountain standing proudly against the horizon. Yet year after year, that short stretch of sea remained uncrossable. History, however, was continuing to move. A new generation of young South Africans was growing up under apartheid. Many had never known another system. Many had grown frustrated. Many were preparing to raise their voices. In our next chapter, we will travel to the township of Soweto, where students protesting against changes to their education would spark one of the most significant uprisings in South African history. The events of 16 June 1976 would once again change the course of the nation. Chapter 8. Soweto 1976, when students changed history. Tonight, we continue our journey into one of the defining moments of modern South African history. Throughout our story, we have seen governments pass laws. We have watched political leaders debate the country's future. We have followed activists, lawyers, teachers, and community organizers as they sought change. But history is not shaped only by presidents or parliaments. Sometimes it is changed by students. Young people, teenagers carrying schoolbooks instead of banners. Children who, one ordinary morning, left home expecting to attend school. Many never imagined they would become part of history. Tonight, we travel to the township of Soweto. Soweto is an abbreviation for Southwestern Townships. Located just outside Johannesburg, it grew rapidly during the 20th century as Black South Africans were relocated under government planning and segregation policies. Families from many parts of the country built new lives there. Houses were modest. Roads were often dusty. Communities developed around schools, churches, sports clubs, small businesses, and local traditions. Despite economic challenges, Soweto was alive with music, conversation, sport, and a strong sense of community. Children played football in open fields. Neighbors gathered on front steps during warm evenings. Life carried on, even under difficult circumstances. By the 1970s, thousands of young people were attending schools throughout Soweto. Classrooms were often crowded. Some schools operated in shifts because there were not enough buildings for the growing population. Teachers worked with limited resources, yet many remained deeply committed to their students. Parents viewed education as one of the few paths toward a better future. Even under apartheid, education represented hope. But not everyone agreed about what that education should look like. More than 20 years earlier, in 1953, the government had introduced the Bantu Education Act. The law placed education for Black South Africans under direct government control. Supporters argued that separate education systems reflected the policy of separate development. Critics believed the system deliberately limited educational opportunities and prepared students for a narrower range of occupations than those available to white South Africans. Schools serving black communities generally received fewer resources than those serving white communities. Many teachers worked tirelessly despite these limitations. Their dedication often became the foundation upon which students built their ambitions. In 1974, another policy added to growing frustration. The government announced that certain secondary school subjects should be taught equally in Afrikaans and English. For many students and teachers, this presented practical and educational challenges. Some teachers were not fluent enough in Afrikaans to teach complex subjects comfortably. Many students already spoke African languages at home while learning in English at school. Adding Afrikaans as a compulsory language of instruction for subjects such as mathematics and social sciences created additional difficulties. Government officials defended the policy. Many students opposed it. Tension quietly increased over the following months. By early 1976, student organizations had begun discussing peaceful demonstrations. Meetings were held after school. Routes were planned. Participants were encouraged to remain orderly. The aim was to express opposition to the language policy through a peaceful march. The organizers hoped their concerns would be heard. No one knew how the day would unfold. On the morning of 16 June 1976, thousands of students left their classrooms. Many wore school uniforms. Some carried homemade signs. Others simply walked alongside friends. As groups from different schools joined together, the procession steadily grew. Teachers watched from classroom windows. Parents noticed unusual movement through the streets. Residents stepped outside their homes to observe. Accounts from those present describe an atmosphere that was initially peaceful. Students sang songs. Some chanted slogans calling for better education. Many believed they were participating in a lawful demonstration. As the march continued, police units moved into position. Roads became blocked. Crowds gathered. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Exactly how events unfolded over the next few moments has been examined by historians, commissions, journalists, and eyewitnesses for decades. It is clear that confusion spread quickly. At one point, police attempted to disperse the crowd. Tear gas was used. Police dogs were released. Soon afterward, officers fired live ammunition. The demonstration dissolved into panic. Students ran in every direction. Some searched for friends. Others sought shelter in nearby homes or school buildings. What had begun as a student march had become a national tragedy. Among those killed was Hector Pietersen, a 13-year-old schoolboy. A photograph taken shortly afterward captured another student, Mbiasa Makhubo, carrying Hector's body while his sister, Antoinette Sithole, ran beside them. The image was published around the world. It became one of the most recognizable photographs of the 20th century. For many people outside South Africa, it was their first close look at the human cost of apartheid. Today, the Hector Pietersen Memorial and Museum in Soweto honors his memory and the many others affected by the events of that day. The unrest did not end on the 16th of June. Over the weeks and months that followed, protests spread to other towns and cities across South Africa. Students continued demonstrating. Communities organized meetings. Security forces remained heavily deployed. Clashes occurred in various places as tensions remained high. The exact number of people who lost their lives during the wider unrest remains uncertain, with estimates differing among historians and official investigations. What is clear is that the events profoundly affected communities across the country. For many young South Africans, Soweto became a turning point. Some students left the country to continue their education abroad. Others joined political organizations in exile. Many became more politically active within their communities. A generation that had grown up entirely under apartheid now began shaping the future of the resistance. The movement against apartheid was no longer led only by experienced political figures. Young people had become central participants. International reaction was swift. Television broadcasts carried images from Soweto into homes across Europe, North America, Asia, and elsewhere in Africa. Newspapers devoted front pages to the events. Governments expressed concern. Human rights organizations increased their campaigns. Universities debated investment in South Africa. Church groups organized discussions and prayer services. Around the world, more people became aware of the realities of apartheid. The issue was no longer viewed only as a domestic South African matter. It had become an international concern. Inside South Africa, daily life continued. Factories opened. Trains ran. Businesses operated. Children returned to classrooms. Yet the atmosphere had changed. Many families now viewed the future with greater uncertainty. Some feared further unrest. Others believed meaningful reform had become unavoidable. Conversations, once held quietly inside homes, increasingly became part of public discussion. The country had entered a new chapter. During the late 1970s, another influential voice emerged through the philosophy of Black consciousness. Its most prominent leader was Steve Biko. Biko encouraged Black South Africans to reject feelings of inferiority and to take pride in their identity, culture, and ability to shape their own future. He emphasized psychological liberation alongside political change. His writings inspired many young people during a period of growing uncertainty. In 1977, Steve Biko died while in police custody after suffering injuries. An official inquest at the time drew widespread criticism, and his death prompted significant international concern and renewed scrutiny of South Africa's security policies. Today, Biko is remembered as one of the most influential intellectual and community leaders of the anti-apartheid era. As our evening gently comes to a close, the streets of Soweto grow quiet once more. School buildings stand where generations have learned. Memorials remind visitors of lives forever changed. The students of 1976 could not have known what history would write about them. Many simply wished to learn, to be heard, and to build a future they believed should be open to everyone. Their actions would echo far beyond the classrooms of Soweto. In our next chapter, we will explore the 1980s, a decade of growing international sanctions, cultural and sporting boycotts, internal unrest, and mounting pressure that brought South Africa closer than ever before to fundamental change. Chapter 9. The world turns its eyes toward South Africa. Tonight, we enter the final decade before apartheid began to unravel. The 1980s were years of remarkable change, not only inside South Africa, but around the world. By now, the story of apartheid had reached millions of people living thousands of kilometers away. Students in London discussed it in university classrooms. Families in Canada watched reports on the evening news. Musicians in Australia dedicated concerts to the cause. Churches in Brazil held prayer services. Athletes debated whether they should compete against South African teams. Governments met behind closed doors to consider economic sanctions. For the first time in its history, South Africa found itself under an extraordinary level of international attention. Inside the country, daily life continued. Office workers caught the morning train. Farmers rose before sunrise. Factories opened their gates. Children walked to school. Shoppers browsed busy streets. On the surface, many routines appeared unchanged. Yet beneath those routines, the political atmosphere was becoming increasingly uncertain. Many South Africans sensed that the country stood at a crossroads. Around the world, a movement calling for economic sanctions gained momentum. The idea was straightforward. If governments and businesses reduced trade, investment, and financial cooperation with South Africa, supporters believed the government might face increasing pressure to reform. Not everyone agreed on this approach. Some argued sanctions could encourage political change. Others feared they would primarily affect ordinary workers by slowing economic growth and reducing employment opportunities. The debate was complex, and governments reached different conclusions at different times. Over the course of the decade, however, many countries introduced various forms of economic and diplomatic restrictions. Large international banks became increasingly cautious about lending money to South Africa. Some multinational companies reduced their investments. Others chose to leave the country entirely. New foreign investment slowed. The value of the South African rand experienced periods of significant pressure. Business leaders began expressing concern about long-term economic stability. Even companies that had no political involvement found themselves operating within an increasingly uncertain environment. At the same time, another form of pressure emerged through sport. For many South Africans, sport had always been an important part of national life. Cricket, rugby, athletics, swimming, tennis. These competitions brought excitement and national pride. Yet many international sporting organizations questioned whether South African teams should continue participating while apartheid remained government policy. Gradually, South Africa found itself excluded from many international competitions. Tours were cancelled. Invitations disappeared. Teams that had once traveled regularly abroad now faced long periods of isolation. For sports-loving South Africans, regardless of political opinion, these changes were deeply felt. The cultural world also responded. Musicians debated whether they should perform in South Africa. Actors discussed international boycotts. Universities reconsidered academic partnerships. Some artists believed refusing to perform would increase pressure on the government. Others questioned whether cultural exchanges should remain open regardless of politics. One entertainment venue in particular became internationally famous: the Sun City Resort. Some performers accepted invitations to appear there. Others declined. In 1985, a group of musicians released the song Sun City, declaring that they would not perform at the resort while apartheid continued. The debate illustrated how South Africa had become part of conversations far beyond its own borders. Within South Africa, resistance also continued evolving. During the early 1980s, a coalition of civic organizations, churches, student groups, trade unions, and community associations came together to form the United Democratic Front, commonly known as the UDF. Rather than functioning as a single political party, the UDF brought together hundreds of organizations with a shared goal of opposing apartheid through largely non-violent civic action. Meetings were organized. Community campaigns expanded. Religious leaders, lawyers, teachers, and ordinary citizens became increasingly involved. The movement reflected the growing diversity of those calling for political reform. Among the most respected voices during this period was Archbishop Desmond Tutu. A clergyman known for his calm manner and powerful sermons, Tutu consistently advocated nonviolent change. He spoke openly against apartheid while also encouraging reconciliation rather than revenge. In 1984, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of his efforts to promote justice through peaceful means. His message reached audiences both inside and outside South Africa. Many people who had never visited the country came to know his name. The government, meanwhile, faced increasing challenges. Demonstrations became more frequent. Some protests remained peaceful. Others developed into violent confrontations between protesters and security forces. Political violence also occurred between different organizations and communities in certain areas, adding further complexity to an already difficult situation. The atmosphere in many townships became increasingly tense. Residents often found themselves living with uncertainty from one week to the next. In 1985, the government declared a state of emergency in parts of the country. Additional emergency regulations granted security authorities expanded powers. Over the following years, these measures were extended more broadly. Curfews were introduced in some areas. Gatherings faced restrictions. Journalists encountered limitations on reporting certain events. Thousands of people were detained under emergency regulations. Supporters argued that these measures were necessary to restore public order. Critics believed they further restricted civil liberties and political expression. The debate remained deeply divisive. Television images from South Africa reached homes across the globe. News broadcasts showed demonstrations, police vehicles, community meetings, and interviews with families living through uncertain times. For many viewers overseas, South Africa had become a familiar presence in international news. Children learning geography now recognized Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, and Soweto. Political leaders regularly discussed South Africa during international summits. What had once seemed like a distant national issue had become a subject of worldwide concern. Meanwhile, on Robben Island, Nelson Mandela remained imprisoned. Year after year, letters continued arriving. Visitors occasionally crossed the waters of Table Bay. International leaders quietly discussed the possibility of negotiations. Rumors circulated from time to time that Mandela might be released if certain conditions were met. Mandela declined offers that required him to renounce his political beliefs or accept restrictions on his principles. His position remained that a lasting peace required broader political negotiations rather than personal concessions alone. Outside the prison, the phrase "Free Nelson Mandela" appeared on banners, posters, T-shirts, and walls across the world. It became one of the most recognized political slogans of the 20th century. By the late 1980s, it had become increasingly clear to many observers that South Africa could not continue indefinitely along its existing path. The economy faced mounting pressures. International isolation had deepened. Communities remained divided. Political violence continued. Even within government circles, discussions about possible reforms became more frequent. No one yet knew how change would come, or when, but more and more people sensed that history was approaching another turning point. As our evening gently draws to a close, we leave South Africa in the final years of the 1980s. The pressure is mounting. The world is watching. Behind prison walls, Nelson Mandela waits. Inside government offices, difficult conversations are beginning. Across the country, millions of ordinary South Africans continue their daily lives, uncertain of what tomorrow may bring. In our next chapter, we will witness one of the most extraordinary political transformations of the modern era. The release of Nelson Mandela. The leadership of President F.W. de Klerk. The negotiations that followed. And the peaceful dismantling of apartheid itself. Chapter 10. Freedom's Dawn, the End of Apartheid. Tonight, we arrive at the final chapter of one of the most remarkable political transformations of the 20th century. For more than 40 years, apartheid had shaped nearly every aspect of life in South Africa. Generations had grown up knowing no other system. Children had become parents. Parents had become grandparents. Entire lives had unfolded beneath laws that divided communities according to race. Yet history has a quiet way of reminding us that no chapter lasts forever. By the close of the 1980s, the winds of change had become impossible to ignore. And in February 1990, the world watched as history turned another page. When Pieter Willem Botha resigned as state president in 1989 due to declining health and political pressure, leadership passed to Frederick Willem de Klerk. Known to most simply as F.W. de Klerk, he had spent much of his political career within the National Party. Many expected him to continue existing government policies. Instead, within months of taking office, he surprised both supporters and critics. De Klerk concluded that South Africa's political future could not be secured through continued confrontation alone. The country faced economic challenges, international sanctions, growing internal unrest, and increasing diplomatic isolation. He believed negotiations had become necessary. On the 2nd of February 1990, Parliament gathered in Cape Town for what many expected to be another routine opening session. Instead, de Klerk delivered a speech that stunned the nation. He announced that several previously banned political organizations, including the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, and the South African Communist Party, would once again be allowed to operate legally. Restrictions on many political activities would be lifted. Most remarkably, he also announced that Nelson Mandela would soon be released from prison. For many South Africans, the announcement seemed almost unbelievable. After 27 years behind bars, the country's most famous political prisoner was coming home. News spread rapidly. Television stations interrupted regular programming. Radio broadcasters repeated the announcement throughout the day. Newspapers rushed to print special editions. Around the world, journalists traveled to South Africa. Crowds gathered outside Victor Verster prison, where Mandela had spent the final portion of his sentence after being transferred from Robben Island. Excitement mixed with uncertainty. No one could predict what would happen next. On 11 February 1990, the prison gates opened. Nelson Mandela walked out alongside his wife, Winnie Madikizela Mandela. He raised his right fist as thousands of supporters cheered nearby. Television cameras carried the images live across the globe. For many viewers, it was the first time they had seen Mandela in nearly 3 decades. He was now 71 years old. His hair had turned grey. The young lawyer who had entered prison in 1962 had become an elder statesman before the world's eyes. Yet his calm expression and measured manner reflected the same dignity many had associated with his name for years. Later that day, Mandela addressed a large crowd from the balcony of Cape Town City Hall. He thanked those who had campaigned for his release. He paid tribute to those who had died during the struggle. He also spoke of reconciliation, democracy, and the difficult work that still lay ahead. Although his release marked an extraordinary milestone, apartheid had not yet ended. Many discriminatory laws remained in place. Political violence continued in parts of the country. Negotiations had only just begun. The early 1990s became a period of intense discussion. Representatives from the government, the ANC, and other political organizations met repeatedly. Some meetings lasted for hours. Others continued over many days. Agreements were reached, then challenged. Sometimes progress appeared encouraging. At other times, negotiations nearly collapsed altogether. Building a peaceful transition required patience from all sides. South Africa's future remained uncertain. Sadly, these years were not free from violence. Communities experienced clashes linked to political rivalry, local tensions, and long-standing grievances. Many families lost loved ones during this difficult period. The negotiations continued despite these setbacks, reflecting the determination of many leaders and community members to avoid a wider civil conflict. Historians often describe the transition as both hopeful and fragile, a time when moments of optimism existed alongside profound uncertainty. Gradually, Parliament repealed many of the laws that had formed the legal framework of apartheid. The Population Registration Act was abolished. The Group Areas Act was repealed. Past laws had already been dismantled during the 1980s. One by one, the legal foundations of the apartheid system disappeared. Ending laws, however, was only part of the challenge. Rebuilding trust after decades of division would take much longer. A new interim constitution was negotiated. Political parties agreed upon rules for South Africa's first democratic election based on universal adult suffrage. For the first time in the nation's history, citizens of all races would be able to vote together in a national election. Election officials faced an enormous task. Millions of people who had never before voted needed to be registered. Polling stations had to be established across cities, towns, farms, and remote rural communities. Ballot papers were printed in vast numbers. Volunteers worked tirelessly to prepare for the historic day. Then, on 27 April 1994, South Africans began voting. Long before sunrise, people formed queues outside polling stations. Some waited patiently for hours. Others remained in line throughout the day. Young adults voted alongside elderly citizens who had spent most of their lives without the opportunity to participate in a national election. Photographs from that week show people smiling, talking quietly, and waiting together beneath the autumn skies. The atmosphere differed from place to place, but many participants later described a sense of anticipation unlike anything they had experienced before. When the votes were counted, the African National Congress received the largest share. Nelson Mandela was elected President of South Africa. F.W. de Klerk became one of the country's deputy presidents as part of a government of national unity. On 10 May 1994, Mandela took the oath of office at the Union Buildings in Pretoria. Leaders from around the world attended the ceremony. Military aircraft flew overhead. The new national flag was raised. For many South Africans, the day symbolized not only a change in government, but the beginning of a new chapter in the nation's history. During his inaugural address, Mandela spoke not of revenge, but of reconciliation. He acknowledged the suffering of the past while expressing hope for the future. He emphasized that South Africa belonged to everyone who lived in it, regardless of race or background. His words reflected a vision shared by many who believed lasting peace would require both justice and cooperation. In the years that followed, South Africa established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Rather than conducting only criminal trials, the commission sought to create a public record of human rights violations committed during the apartheid era and the years of political conflict. Victims shared deeply personal testimony. Some perpetrators who made full disclosure of politically motivated crimes could apply for amnesty under specific legal conditions. The process was not without controversy. Some believed it helped the country confront its past and avoid further cycles of violence. Others felt that justice remained incomplete for many victims and families. Even today, historians, legal scholars, and South Africans continue to discuss its legacy. More than 3 decades have now passed since South Africa's first democratic election. The country has achieved much. It has also continued to face significant challenges, including inequality, unemployment, crime, and ongoing debates about land, economic opportunity, education, and social justice. These issues are complex and remain subjects of active public discussion. Modern South Africa cannot be understood solely through the lens of apartheid, nor can its present be separated entirely from that history. Like every nation, it continues to evolve. As our long journey through history comes gently to its end, we return to where we began. To the southern tip of Africa, a land of remarkable beauty. A place shaped by ancient civilizations, by explorers, by kingdoms, by miners, by farmers, by teachers, by students, by prisoners, by presidents, and by millions of ordinary people whose daily lives formed the true fabric of the nation's story. The history of apartheid is not a simple tale of heroes and villains. It is a history of laws and resistance, of fear and hope, of division and reconciliation. It reminds us that institutions can shape societies for generations, but also that people, through dialogue, perseverance, and the difficult work of compromise, can reshape history. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most significant chapters in South African history. If you've enjoyed this quiet exploration, I hope you'll return for another evening with the Silent Collection, where together we'll continue uncovering the stories that have shaped our world, one peaceful chapter at a time. Until next time, sleep well and let history rest beside you.